Hello everybody, thank you again for attending the ISMTE 2021 global event and for joining us for the first of two sessions that we're hosting on diversity and editorial processes. My name's Helen and I'm the Community Manager for Prelights, which is the preprint highlighting initiative supported by the Company of Biologists, and I'm delighted to be on the organising subcommittee for the ISMTE global virtual event. In this session, we'll be hearing from a representative from COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics, which is a non-profit organisation aiming to define best practices in the ethics of scholarly publishing and to aid editors and publishers in achieving this. We'll have plenty of time for questions after Kim's finished speaking, but do feel free to submit your questions at any time in the Q&A panel, and you can also upvote questions from other attendees that you find interesting. Before we get started, our thanks go to our sponsors, which you can see here. And to introduce Kim, with over 15 years' experience in the publishing industry, Kim's role at IOP Publishing is firmly tied to improving the diversity of players within peer review and publishing. Keen to go beyond words and enact real change within the system, Kim is especially interested in how technologies can support inclusivity. Today she'll be talking about the main objectives and achievements to date of COPE, and more broadly about diversity and inclusion in the editorial process. So with that, I'll hand over to Kim, and we'll welcome any questions that you have at the end of the presentation.
Thank you very much, Helen, and hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, wherever you are. Just bear with me a moment while I get my screen share working, and hopefully we can get started. So thank you, Helen, for that introduction. My name is Kim. I'm the Research Integrity and Inclusion Manager at IOP Publishing. I was going to be joined by my colleague Laura. She's unfortunately unable to be with us today, but to give her credit, she has fed into this presentation. So thank you, Laura, in your absence for the work that you've done on this. What I'm going to focus on today, I'm really wearing a different hat today to my normal IOP Publishing hat. I'm representing COPE, so I'm going to introduce COPE as an organisation and what it does, but then move on to talk about why we believe diversity, equity and inclusion is a really important sort of tenet of research integrity and the work that COPE's doing to try and improve diversity, equity and inclusion, not only for them as an organisation, but also for our wider scholarly publishing industry. So to introduce myself properly, like I said, my name is Kim. I work at IOP Publishing. My job is I spend about 50% of my time working on integrity. So that's managing cases of alleged misconduct, ranging the whole gamut from authorship disputes, plagiarism to data fabrication, image manipulation. And as part of my role working on integrity, I was recently elected to the Committee for Publication Ethics, which is what I'm going to talk to you about today. So I'm a council member for the committee, which means that it's a voluntary position. I'm not paid, but I do some voluntary work with them. One of my roles is on our Facilitation and Integration Committee, which effectively assesses cases that are sent to us. So if it's alleged that a publisher perhaps hasn't handled a case of misconduct that well, it's sometimes referred on to COPE, and we would advise the publisher on how to proceed in that situation. So very firmly wearing my COPE hat. COPE is a member organisation focused on publication ethics and supporting those in bringing research to publication. So it's run by a small number of professional staff and then an army of volunteers, myself being one of them. And we provide guidance and advice on matters relating to publication misconduct. We're generally seen as the industry body for publication ethics, and being a member of COPE means that you, as a journal, meet certain standards and you abide by the COPE guidelines. Members are usually at the journal level, sometimes they're at the publisher level. So my publisher, IOP Publishing, is a member of COPE, and our 50-something journals are also individual members in their own right as well. So COPE was founded in 1997. It was quite an informal gathering of just a group of concerned editors, really, who a guy called Mike Farthing, who was in his first year as editor of a journal called Gut. And he encountered 4 cases of misconduct in his first year, and he was wondering Is that unusual? Is that normal? And so he started talking to other editors, and they all met together and agreed that actually some support and some collegiate work together in this area would be really helpful. So the first number of journals that were attending that first meeting was the BMJ, the Lancet, and some other mostly clinical sort of biological journals. And they began COPE back in 1997 as a way of editors supporting each other, really, as they were handling these kind of allegations of misconduct. Looking now into 2021, COPE members now exceed 12,500, which is really remarkable. From over 103, I think it is, different countries now. We regularly host events and seminars as well as providing a wealth of resources, including the opportunity to submit cases and get advice. And that is something that we as IOP Publishing really appreciate, having COPE there to kind of give us advice when we come across a case that is maybe a little bit unusual or we're not quite sure how to proceed. Bear with me while I just move the slide on. So COPE in itself is considerably more diverse in representation now than it ever has been. However, a quick look at this map, which just shows you the people that are working and advising COPE, shows you that there is still a lot of work to be done. There is a very heavy bias still to the UK and the US, and we are really actively trying to broaden the reach of COPE, but also the people that influence COPE and the decision making that goes on at COPE. We need to make sure that that's more globally representative. So just to highlight that and reflect that we are aware that as an organisation we are not yet as representative as we would like to be. And if after this talk anyone is interested in working with COPE more, I'd be very happy to speak to you outside of this session. So some of the things that COPE advises on are shown on this slide. Now, being a member of COPE means that you follow the policies and the core practices designed by COPE for handling matters relating to publication ethics. So as you can see, the guidance covers a really wide range of issues. The material is regularly updated and added to as new challenges and opportunities surface. Publication ethics is a changing landscape. I've only worked in it for properly worked in it for about 5 years now. And the ways in which misconduct is committed and also discovered has changed almost unrecognisably just in that 5 years time. So from when COPE was originally set up back in 1997, the guidance that's provided has moved on, incredibly and at a remarkable pace. But we've also these are the kind of the main things that we advise on, but some recent materials that have not yet been added to this slide include the use of AI, artificial intelligence, in decision making, guidance on editing, peer reviews, what it means to be an editorial board member and how editorial board members are expected to participate and be recruited, and also how post-publication critiques should be handled by journals. So this is an evolving picture, and if there isn't information on the COPE website but that you think COPE might be able to advise on, they're always willing and keen to hear from ideas from people. So please do reach out to either myself or COPE more generally through their website. So what I'm going to do now is take a little bit of time to show you some of the some examples of the materials that COPE shares. Hopefully you will find something in there that might be useful. Like I say, if you do think there's something missing, please do shout. Because of the wide range of things that COPE has available and offers advice on, I'm not going to go through everything. I'm just going to pick out a few kind of highlights just to really show the range of things that we provide guidance on and can consult on. So the first resource that I wanted to bring to your attention is our guidelines on managing misconduct and specifically sharing information between editors. We often find, in my own experience at IOP anyway, that some of our misconduct cases are also relevant to other titles, not necessarily other IOP publishing titles. So it might be appropriate for me to contact somebody, maybe an editor at another publisher, or my kind of peer at another publisher, another research integrity specialist, And COPE recognised that that can be quite a difficult thing to do. We're not maybe sure of, well, how much information could or should we share? At what point is it appropriate to reach out to that other person at the other organisation? And so these guidelines are really brilliant at giving you some reassurance and helping you understand, when can I reach out to another editor or, you know, another representative of a publisher? What information do I need to keep confidential? Whose identity do I need to make sure I protect? So, for example, whistleblowers, the people that usually raise the kind of flag and say, I think something bad's happened, we generally operate on an anonymity basis, so their identity is completely protected, and it's generally encouraged that we don't share that identity even with another publisher. So this guidance covers those kind of issues, and it's really just about how to share the most relevant information with any other potentially affected journals. So these guidance, like I say, we find it really useful because a lot of the time the cases that we're working on do affect other journals, and we want to make sure that we're doing it properly and ethically and making sure we don't influence anyone else's investigation unduly as well. The second resource I wanted to share with you relates to one of the most common allegations that I deal with in my day-to-day work, and that is around plagiarism. So that is essentially passing someone else's work off as your own. It also includes reusing your own work without being transparent about the fact that it's already published. That's often called self-plagiarism or text recycling. There are lots of different words that are sometimes used to describe the same thing, and that's also a really good thing that COPE offers, is a bit of an understanding into some of the jargon and the text and the words that are used that aren't often that easily understood, especially if you're relatively either new to the industry or working in journals. So that's another really useful thing on the COPE website. Matters relating to intellectual property can be incredibly complex, made more so by a number of relatively recent changes and initiatives across the industry, all of which are very much, you know, for the greater good. But what they do is add that extra level of complexity for integrity. So I'm thinking about things like preprints, CC-BY licenses, and I'll talk later in a minute about paper mills. So preprints and CC-BY licenses are all things that generally we all think are really brilliant, and you know, this is about opening up the world of peer review and scholarly publishing and making sure that people can access the work that we publish as soon as possible. They can, you know, in the context of preprints, they can see the journey maybe that a paper has gone through in order to reach publication. And in CC-BY licenses, we want to make sure that as many people can read work as possible. But what that does from an intellectual property perspective is it does bring some complexity. Sort of 10 or 20 years ago, it was quite common for publishers to hold the copyright for the article that they published, and it was the only version that would be available. It was usually in printed form. And it was quite straightforward, really, to kind of identify, okay, well, that work has been copied from this other piece of work, and proceed accordingly. But with preprints and CC-BY licenses, we now have to take into account, well, where was that first, you know, hosted, and who has the copyright on that first version that was published, or not published necessarily if it was a preprint. So there's a lot of different sort of layers of complexity in there, and that's something that I've definitely found really useful on COPE, on COPE's website, is understanding how those kind of issues can make a difference when you're investigating a case of plagiarism or text recycling. Some of the COPE materials include flowcharts, discussion documents, and webinars. The flowcharts, I would say, are the things that you would find yourself using on a day-to-day basis. So that's when you've potentially got an allegation of misconduct. Start using the flowchart, and it really shows you from that initial allegation the steps that you need to follow. So who do you need to consult with? What kind of questions do you need to be asking yourself? For example, would we consider this significant plagiarism, or is it quite minor plagiarism? And then the flowchart takes you through, well, what might the appropriate actions be in this case? So might you be looking at a post-publication correction? Might it be slightly more serious, and might a retraction be warranted? Or actually, is this a situation where no correction is needed? It might be that some re-education is all that's needed, or actually there's no case to answer to. So those flowcharts are really helpful for just clearly laying out that step-by-step process. What should I be doing? What questions should I be asking, and to whom? And how do we finalise this in a way that means, the integrity of the scholarly record has been protected in the most respectful way. The one thing that I did want to touch on this slide, which is a really new thing for the industry, but a really puzzling thing for us to deal with, and that is paper mills. For anyone who's not aware of what a paper mill is, it's effectively, most commonly, a commercial organisation that is basically selling research papers. So for scholars who, for whatever reason, aren't writing the papers themselves, they're using a paper mill to supply them with an article that they then submit to a journal. We're seeing a real increase in this kind of misconduct. I speak personally as a representative of IOP Publishing. We're seeing an increase in articles that we suspect are coming out of paper mills, and I know that colleagues elsewhere are. And this is one of the reasons that COPE, they held a forum last year where the topic was discussed. They had a seminar I think it was just last week or the week before, on the same issue, and they are now working on a joined up group of publishers who are all looking at this issue and trying to come up with some best practice and guidance on how to deal with papers that you think might have originated from a paper mill. Some of the problems that we have with paper mills is that it tends to be prolific. So a paper mill might have produced, thousands of papers in their time. And one of the things we're trying to do is identify the hallmarks of a paper mill article. And some of the things we've noticed is that they're quite formulaic, they're templated. Some of the same references seem to appear a lot of the time in a paper mill paper. So that's one of the things that working group is looking at, is how can we as a publishing industry try and prevent this kind of work getting published in the first place. To date, a lot of the paper mill work that we've been doing has really been trying to clean up what's already been published. What we need to do is move to more of a proactive stance on this. It is a really complicated issue. I'm really pleased to say that technology hopefully can be our friend here, and we hope that we can be working with those plagiarism detection companies. So the one that I'm most familiar with is Authenticate and Crossref. And hopefully there are maybe some solutions there that might enable us to detect these kind of papers much more quickly than we have been able to date. But there's some great COPE resources already. Just because we don't have the answer to the paper mill problem doesn't mean there aren't still things to learn. So do go and have a look at the notes from that forum, or I think there's a video available of the seminar from the other week where they talk about paper mills in depth. So do go and have a look at those resources if you're interested. The next thing I wanted to highlight was manipulation of the peer review process. Again, this is a relatively new thing for the industry, probably, because we've moved so much more to online now. There are probably little vulnerabilities in all of our processes and some of the technology as well that have enabled peer review manipulation to become reasonably commonplace now. And this really new resource is going to help editors manage allegations of this type. So this is a flowchart, and there's also an infographic that accompanies this to help editors and publishers manage allegations of peer review manipulation. Some of the types of manipulation that we're seeing include fake peer review. So that's when authors are actually reviewing their own manuscripts, having recommended a reviewer that actually turns out to be themselves. So when on a submission system, we're saying, would you like to recommend any reviewers to look at this paper? Authors are sometimes saying, so-and-so would be great for this paper. And it might be that name is a very reputable, well-known, respected name in the discipline. But what the authors are doing are putting the email for that person, either as a quite an obvious wrong email, or sometimes a much more crafty, sort of intelligent way of, it might be that just one letter of the person's name is misspelled, or it has a number after the name. A usual telltale sign is that it's a non-institutional email address. So maybe a Gmail address, or a 123.com, that kind of thing. That might be an indication that the email is not legitimate, or that the person isn't who they're claiming to be. But what these authors are doing is relying on the editors using those recommended reviewers, and the authors are then, obviously, they've got access to their email account, so they're going and reviewing the paper themselves. And unsurprisingly, the review is very complimentary and the paper is accepted. So we're seeing a few cases of that, certainly around the industry. The other thing we've seen on a lesser scale, but I've certainly heard of cases where the authors are actually submitting their article with a review that they're claiming was done by another journal. When it's been looked into and the other journal's been contacted, that wasn't the case. The journal's never seen the paper before. But again, the authors are relying on the editors kind of thinking, oh, brilliant, we've already got a review. I don't need to put this through my own peer review process. I can just work with the authors to make some edits. And as you can normally imagine, the reviews in that case were reasonably complimentary. They just had a few sort of low-level edits that were needed that the authors obviously knew they could do quite easily. So that's another thing to look out for. The other thing that I know Retraction Watch have published on reasonably recently is special issues. This is where a guest editor has contacted a journal claiming to have either pre-arranged or done the peer review, so that there's an issue ready to publish, as it were, or they're conducting the peer review themselves, but to a very, very substandard level where a reputable publisher would not accept. So again, being contacted by somebody with a very too good to be true special issue might be something to look out for. A lot of these cases also include some kind of identity fraud, so where someone is claiming to be somebody else. Despite initiatives like ORCID, the industry really hasn't come up with much of a solution for preventing this. One of the solutions that I hear quite often is, well, why don't we just insist on institutional email addresses on all our submission systems? And some of the issues with that are really about global, the way that different companies and different countries operate, and the way that different institutions operate. And it's quite commonplace in a number of countries, especially in Asia and South America, that institutional addresses are not used. They exist purely for administrative purposes in the institution, things like booking holiday, your paycheck might be sent through that, but they're not used as a communication device. So it's absolutely normal for the academics to have, a Gmail or a 123.com email address. And so by putting that kind of ideally, preventative measure in place to say we're only going to take institutional email addresses, we'd actually be alienating a huge proportion of our customers. By customers, I'm talking about authors and reviewers. And so that kind of solution really isn't appropriate. So COPE has, like I say, some resources, not all the answers, far from it, but some, things that you need to look at if you're dealing with these kind of allegations that might include identity theft, or at least an allegation of it. Use that COPE flowchart to help you work through that. It's a fantastically useful resource. The final thing that I wanted to point out was authorship problems. Again, this is probably the most common allegation that I deal with, is authorship issues. And it's when there's maybe a dispute between authors, or someone's alleging that they've been missed off a paper when they shouldn't have been, or that they've been included on a paper where they actually didn't contribute at all or didn't know anything about it. So authorship disputes are something that we see really commonly. There are a number of flowcharts for authorship issues, including guest, ghost, or gift authorship, but also just like those kind of proactive steps, how you might spot authorship problems at the very beginning. So, way before it's got to publication stage. There's some really useful documentation in there, and how to deal with changes in authorship as well. So if a new author is brought in, maybe at revision stage or even post acceptance stage, how you might deal with that. That's a flowchart for that. Or if someone is removed the same kind of flowcharts exist if somebody's asked to be removed from a paper at any stage of submission or publication, how you need to go about doing that. One of the most interesting events that I've been to recently, it was a seminar, again, just a couple of weeks ago, on authorship for sale. I would really encourage you to look that out if you're interested in this. Authorship for sale, it's a little bit like the paper mill challenge that I mentioned a few moments ago, but it's also where papers are either at that very final stage of being accepted. So they may be in final stages of revision, or they've just been accepted. Some papers are appearing on websites basically saying, do you want to buy an authorship spot on the paper? And these authorship spots are going for anything from a couple of $100s to maybe a couple of $1,000. That seems to vary depending on the journal that the paper is hopefully going to be published in. And those authorship spots are being bought and sold. And we as publishers really need to step up and try and identify where that's happening. As a company, so with my IOP publishing hat on, this is something that we've really tightened up on in the last couple of months. We appreciate that it can be seen as a bit of a barrier for authors. We're making them go through hoops to prove that somebody has contributed, but given the prevalence of these kind of websites that are selling authorship, we just have to, it's the responsible thing to do. So there's some really good resources there that I would encourage you to have a look at. Like I mentioned, COPE also offers seminars and webinars. There's a really great YouTube resource. So a lot of the sessions that COPE hosts are then hosted on YouTube. So go and have a look at them if you missed anything, or if you didn't register but you want to go back and have a listen to something, then do go and have a look at their YouTube page. It's really useful. And also, we're really trying hard to translate some of our resources. We know that at the moment, everything's pretty much published in English on our website, and we're working hard to try and make sure that some of the more common languages across the world are also served. So we're looking at translating our work into Chinese, Spanish, Turkish, etc. So that's my sort of introduction to COPE, which I appreciate was quite long-winded, but I really hope there's some useful information in there. I should say that while we obviously want people to be a COPE member, and you'll get the most benefit from COPE's resources by being a COPE member. For example, we have an e-learning portal where you can go and you can actually sort of educate yourself and encourage your editors to be educated as well on issues of misconduct. Even if you're not a COPE member, some of this material is still available for free. So even if you're not a COPE member, your journal is not a COPE member, don't let that put you off going to have a look. There is still a lot of free resources on there that I'm sure you would find helpful. So moving on to diversity now, which is the other 50% of my job. What has COPE got to do with diversity? Well, I think we can all agree that we were quite glad to put 2020 behind us. But it was a real year of reckoning from a diversity perspective, not only because of the pandemic, but also because of things like the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. They have led to a much brighter spotlight being shown on inequalities, not only in the justice system, but across multiple sectors of society, including academia and also academic publishing. And the COVID pandemic has also led to concerns about inequalities being further entrenched. So, for example, was there a decline in output from women during lockdown when education and childcare closed down? There's increasing evidence suggesting that those more sort of formal roles, or not formal, sorry, more traditional roles of women doing the majority of the housework and the childcare, we kind of reverted back a few years, and women seem to take on the brunt of the home education and things, while perhaps some of the more some of our male counterparts' careers were not as affected. And it certainly seems like there's evidence for that happening in academia. So since the turning point in 2020, there has really been this increased focus on inequity, and it's led publishers to analyse not only their workforces, so looking at their staff, but also the communities that they're representing, to try and understand whether their products and services are genuinely reflective of those communities or not. So for possibly the first time, collectively, publishers have been questioning whether the processes and systems they have in place, often for very good reason, might actually be acting as barriers for some people. So that example I gave about institutional email addresses is a really nice example of where a publisher might be thinking about putting a rule in place. Basically, we're not going to deal with anyone that doesn't have an institutional email address, but actually they'd be excluding people, in this instance, probably on a geographic basis, either without realizing or, knowledgeably excluding people for what they think is a really good reason, but perhaps haven't thought through the consequences. So this is just something that publishers just starting to reckon with now, is looking at their systems and processes and thinking, actually, is this a barrier for somebody? And do we need to be trying to dismantle that and rebuild it in a better, more inclusive way? So research integrity and how this fits with research integrity, for me, at the very fundamental level, research integrity is about doing the right thing. It's about being honest, transparent, and respectful. And inclusion is exactly the same. I really like this definition from UKRI, which is the UK's research integrity body, about integrity, being about values of honesty, rigor, transparency, and open communication, as well as care and respect for those involved and accountability for a positive research environment. I love that statement. And to me, that really speaks to DEI as well. So diversity and equity and inclusion are absolutely taken into account in that statement. And historically, research integrity probably hasn't. We've not passed diversity off as someone else's problem, but we haven't taken much ownership of diversity. And I think that tide is really changing now. So about research integrity is about being a good human, doing right by others and not seeking any kind of unfair advantage or overlooking others. And that's really the attitude that COPE is taking, is to try and make sure that we've got a renewed focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and acknowledging our own challenges. We need and want to be a much more diverse and representative organisation, but really embracing diversity as a central tenet of research integrity and making sure that what COPE provides to the industry is much more inclusive and robust in terms of diversity. There's really not been much of a focus paid until now, and it's a big oversight, in my opinion. I think COPE, other COPE representatives would say the same thing. So we're working really hard to play our part in the wider ongoing conversation taking place across the scholarly communications ecosystem about creating a more diverse and inclusive environment where voices can be heard, regardless of background or geography. It's a work in progress. There's no doubt about that. I think that's, true of COPE and publishers. So saying that with both hats on, IOP is very much treating it in the same way. But we are taking steps, and we recognise that we, along with colleagues at universities, publishers, funders, journals, we all have more work to do to create a more open and equitable system. The challenges facing scholars from historically marginalised groups are structural, and they exist at the institutional level, the discipline level, the publisher level, and the individual journal level. And I think only by accepting that and recognising that we all need to work together to the same end will we actually achieve some real momentum and sustainable change. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time now talking about the equalities that do exist within academia and publishing. I'm going to take it as read, though, that we accept that academia has a diversity problem. I'm very happy to spend a little bit of time with anyone who disagrees. It's a bit of a soapbox of mine, so you might get you won't get out of the room in half an hour, but it's generally well accepted that academia is not a particularly diverse place. It's there are issues of gender, there's disproportionate, sorry, losing my words. Gender is not particularly well represented. We know that males are more represented in general academia, less so in social sciences, but certainly in the natural sciences, it's more of a male space. And we also know that geographically, there is a bit of a bias still towards sort of a bit of a white Western view on things. The fact that publishing and academia generally, but certainly publishing, tends to operate with English language as the de facto norm, also means that geographically there are disparities, and it's not an even playing field basically for everybody. But the fact that academia isn't a diverse space means that publishers, it's quite easy to absolve publishers of much responsibility. People sort of say, oh, well, we can only publish the people that submit to us, or the people that volunteer as reviewers. We can only work with the people that volunteer. But by that thinking, the fact that sectors of societies are underrepresented in our publications, that kind of thinking suggests that we're a passive part of the scholarly community, which I don't think is how any publisher wants to think of themselves or be perceived. And some of the evidence on this slide that I'm about to show you shows some of the biases that have been studied within the context of peer review. So, for example, we know that the decision makers in the publishing sphere, so that's thinking about the editorial boards, the reviewers, they are overrepresented by the Anglo-speaking nations. So that's the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, some parts of Europe, but mostly those Anglo-speaking nations. And we also know that the country from which an author is affiliated has a bearing on how that research is perceived. So we know that the identity of an author makes a difference to whether you're likely to be published or not. What's also interesting is that who judges your work has also been shown to have an impact on your publication chances. So these studies here, and I apologize, this is a really text-heavy slide, but hopefully you'll get a copy of the slides if you're interested in reading these and following the links through to the published articles. What's interesting is that who judges your work also has an impact on your publication chances. So these studies all show that the more a reviewer looks like the author, the more likely the author is to have their work accepted. So this is known as homophily for people who like big words. I would count myself in that group. This means that the people we use on our editorial boards and our reviewers are having an impact on the demographics of our author community. So we know, for example, that reviewers are more likely, if the reviewer is based in the US, if the paper is from some authors in the US, the reviewer is more likely to recommend acceptance. We know that if all the reviewers are male, the acceptance rate for male authors are higher than for female authors. We know that if the gender and country of the reviewers matches the gender and country of the authors, the paper is more likely to be accepted. So there's a lot of evidence to suggest that there absolutely is bias in peer review, and it matters. It matters because it's affecting who's getting published. And one of the ways in which we might be able to influence this is by looking at who those gatekeepers and those decision makers are. One of the examples that I heard really recently from a Ghanaian researcher, Elsie Kaufman, and she's often told that her work has no relevance to a journal's global readership because she's often working, in Ghana, or so she's either working with Ghanaian participants or she's working on environmental issues that are specific to Ghana. But to actually be told that by a journal, or this isn't relevant to our global readership, sends a really horrible and I think untrue message. It sends the message that the world doesn't care about your country or your work, and that you are seen as other. There's the global readership, and then there's Ghana as this separate other thing, and it's not, seen as a valid, valuable part of the world. So the question that she asks is, well, you've published studies based on a US publication, so why is that more appropriate for publication than a study that looks at a Ghanaian population? And I think that's, a really interesting live example of some of the ways those biases are just very vocalized. And we think of bias, I think, often as an unconscious thing, but actually we're doing it quite consciously a lot of the time as well. And we really need to be honest and reflect ourselves about what's happening there. I'm really conscious of time, so I'm going to try and just whiz through the next few slides so that we've got time for questions. This was just a really nice graphic that I like that displays how publishers not taking this seriously creates this kind of vicious cycle, disadvantaging the same people over and over again. This example was specifically focused on gender, but it applies to many disadvantaged groups. So some of the work that COPE has been doing, like I said, COPE really are at the beginning of their diversity journey. Sorry, you can tell I work in publishing. I say journal all the time. Some of the examples of work that COPE's been doing, we recently published some guidance on how and why to diversify editorial boards. We've talked a little bit about why that might be important, but what's really important as well is, well, how do you do it? It's not just enough to go and ask your existing board to nominate other people. You might want to think about the different types of diversity that you need on your board and how to go about recruiting those people. So that's a great resource. I would encourage people to go and have a look at that if you're particularly interested in diversifying your boards. I know there was a session, it's either later today or earlier today, I'm not sure, on name changing and why a lot of publishers are now changing their policies on enabling people essentially to change their name on published work. And COPE has also recognised that this is an issue. They've published a small amount of work on this at the moment, but they are currently creating some more practical functional guidance for publishers on how they might go about changing their policy when looking at helping authors to change their name on previously published work. And the final thing I wanted to draw your attention to was a survey that has recently closed, but we conducted a survey in 2018 on peer review diversity. We've just rerun it in 2021 to try and understand how attitudes have changed about diversity in peer review. We haven't yet published the results from the 2021 survey. It only closed last week. But we will be doing so. And having had a very sneak preview, it is looking like there are some significant differences, reflecting the fact that diversity is much more at the forefront of everybody's minds. The last thing to mention is that there is a COPE forum tomorrow, which is probably a bit late, and I don't want to distract you from this conference. But if you sign up, you will get the video of the event, so don't feel like you need to attend at the time. But there is a forum tomorrow where the topic for discussion is going to be bias in peer review, which is a topic very close to my own heart. So I'm really looking forward to that. And hopefully some of you might also be able to attend. So the very last thing to end on is thank you so much for your time. I'm sorry if it's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour. There's more information on COPE at this web address, and COPE are also on Twitter. Do note, if you're looking for COPE on Twitter, that what you think is an O is a 0 because someone had already taken the handle COPE. So if you're looking for COPE on Twitter, just make sure that you've got that numerical 0 in there. I've got a little bit of time now to take some questions, but if you have questions that I don't manage to get to, I'm really happy for people to contact me. My email address is kim.eggleton@ioppublishing.org, and my Twitter handle is eggletonkim. If you can't get hold of me for any reason, I'm sure the folk at ISMTE will be happy to put you in touch. So I'm going to now have a look at the Q&A and hopefully take some questions from the audience. So we've got a question here from Juanita, who I can't quite see your affiliation. You're either based in Cambridge or you work for Cambridge University Press, I can't tell. But Juanita has asked, does blinding, i.e. triple or double blinding or even open peer review, have similar effects regarding inequalities in the peer review process? Excellent question. And this is what I spend a lot of my day-to-day, my time doing, is trying to answer that question. We don't know, in short, we don't know. There aren't a huge amount of studies on bias with a blinding or an anonymity aspect. A lot of the studies that have been done under the single anonymous method. So the author's identities are known, the reviewer's identities are not. That is the norm in STEM or in the natural sciences. What we're seeing now is a number of journals moving either to a fully open system or a fully anonymized system. And we're trying as fast as we can to get data on, do those biases and inequalities still exist under those two systems? The suspicion is that under an open system they would, because that unconscious bias is still possible, but that under an anonymous system they should be less likely. And we know from outside of publishing, so I'm thinking of the recruitment industry, and there was also a really interesting study done on orchestras and auditions in orchestras that showed that when they effectively blinded the judging panels, or they anonymised the people that were applying. It certainly had an impact on the gender. So in the orchestra study, they found that women were like twice as likely to be accepted into the orchestra when the judging panel was sort of blinded to the identity of the applicant. So we know from other examples that it should have a difference, but what we don't know is it does have a difference. And we've also got to bear in mind, when you're talking about anonymity in a publishing context, things like preprints, institutional web pages, conferences, it's quite easy now to find out who's written a piece of work. So even if the research article itself is anonymized, it might still be quite possible for the reviewer to go and find that person's identity if they want to. So there's a big question there about, is anonymity even possible these days? When you're thinking about it in a recruitment sense, it is, because you can either physically put someone behind a panel, or you can strip names out and institutions out of a CV. But when you're talking about research work, academics tend to follow a reasonably niche course of work throughout their career. It doesn't deviate much. It's quite easy to go and find out who's written that work. So part of the work that we're doing at IOP Publishing, so putting my IOP hat on now, we are one of the publishers that's recently announced we are moving all our journals from the single anonymous method to the double anonymous method. And we've just agreed with some researchers who study this, or peer review more generally, that we're going to be sharing our data. So we're going to share our 3 years historical data and our 3 years forward-looking data, all about peer review, who's doing it, and what are the results. And ultimately what we're trying to do is answer Juanita's question. So I would say watch this space. We're converting all our journals. We'll have all our journals converted by the end of November, which is not long now. We're starting to share data with the researchers already. So our hope is that maybe by this time next year, we'll have some preliminary answers to that question. But the short answer is we don't know, but we hope so. So I hope that goes some way to answering your question. I'm not seeing, oh, bless you, thank you, thumbs up, people. I'm not seeing any other questions in the Q&A. Helen, how much more time do we have?
Yeah, unfortunately, we're out of time now.
We're done. Okay.
Thank you. That was a brilliant talk. I'm sure lots of food for thought there, and we could talk about that for a long time. But thank you to Kim. That was a brilliant presentation. The second of our diversity and editorial processes panel is happening after this one, so do check that out if you're interested. I'm sure lots of you will be attending. But thank you all for coming to this session. I hope you enjoy the rest of the sessions and that you're having a good time at the ISMTE Global Virtual event. Thanks very much.